Hi everybody, my name is Carl Hopwood. I work as an online safety consultant, but my background's in teaching. I was a primary school teacher and primary school head teacher for quite a number of years. But for the last 15 years, this has been my job. You know, I work in schools across the country, and I'll speak to all sorts of different stakeholders who are interested or involved in keeping children safe while they're online. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what children are doing when they're online, some of the risks that I think they face, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about what schools need to do in order to keep them safe, some of the statutory requirements that we're seeing from government. The quote on that first slide there is actually from Ofcom, and it's just making the point, you know, that we very often talk about children's online lives and children's offline lives, but I think, you know, increasingly that is becoming meaningless, as it says, because, you know, a lot of the time that they are spending living their lives, you know, in 2022, it's online. You know, they're just constantly connected. So I think, you know, we just have to accept that much of what they do does involve technology or the internet in some way, shape or form. That said, it probably doesn't surprise you to know that the government are still talking about online versus offline, and so I think, you know, throughout the presentation I will keep referring to that. There's 152 references to the word online within Keeping Children Safe in Education, the version that came out in September, and it's littered with references to the things that schools need to do in order to keep children safe when they are online or when they are offline. And I think it's a bit strange in some ways that it's Keeping Children Safe in Education that actually mandates schools to be, you know, delivering online safety as part of the curriculum, but that is where it sits. There's been an increased focus this particular year on governors, so governors needing to understand how online safety is being taught, how you're filtering and monitoring the internet, and how effective what you're doing is. And I think there's also an increased focus on parents and schools being quite, you know, transparent with parents about what they're doing in terms of online safety. Equally, if you look at ISI for independent schools, it's very clear leadership must ensure, you know, strong language that the school has got these effective arrangements which are regularly reviewed, which I think is really important, so that pupils do know how to stay safe while they're online. I wanted to just briefly make a quick reference to the ICSA inquiry, which many of you will be familiar with. There was a huge part of that that looked at, you know, online issues, and just 2 points that I wanted to draw out. One echoes what I've just said that was in Casey, which is about governance, and, you know, recognising, particularly here looking at, I think, the stuff around online sexual harassment, but governors need better training. They need to be more involved in some of this stuff. And then really interesting, I think, 67% of the under 12s, 46% of the 13 to 18 year olds are saying actually we'd like more online safety education when we're in schools. What I think isn't written is that they don't want more of the stuff that we've already been giving them, that they want better, I think, and perhaps more effective and impactful online safety education, which is why I think they need to be involved. I think we need to have conversations with young people about, you know, what it is that we're teaching and whether actually it's what they need and what makes a difference to them. So I'm going to start with a really quick overview of the research. I'm using Ofcom's research, and I should have said, by the way, that I've put together a PDF which has got links to all of the research, all the resources I'm going to mention, all the government documentation, although I'm sure you're very familiar with that anyway, and I'm sure that you'll get this alongside the recording, so it is there if you need it. So what you can see on the screen, this came out in April. Ofcom published this research annually. It's incredibly detailed. I'll just pick a couple of things out with each age group. So where it says 3 and 4, this is 3 and 4 year olds. It's not year 3 and 4. 17% have their own mobile phone. That's quite a significant increase on the previous year. 89% are using video sharing platforms. And in the main, at this particular age, that is YouTube. If you look at this slide, this is showing 3 right up to 17-year-olds, and it's showing the type of content that young people are consuming, the type of content that they're watching when they're using these video sharing platforms. And I think it's quite, you know, reassuring to a certain extent that, you know, cartoons, animations, mini movies and songs are important, you know, to children who are only 3 and 4 years old. That feels reasonably age appropriate. But the number one thing that they're doing, certainly across the age, is watching funny videos and jokes and pranks and challenges. And the percentages that I've put under the graph are the percentages of the different age groups who are looking at this sort of content. Now, I'm not for a second saying that there is anything wrong with watching funny videos, jokes and pranks and challenges. I think a lot of people would argue that as a society, we quite like that sort of thing. Some of you will remember Jeremy Beadle on You've Been Framed. And it's still on today, isn't it? I think with Harry Hill or somebody like that. But I think the big change for our children is that they are watching, you know, their TikTokers, their Instagrammers, you know, their YouTubers, their influencers, if you like, and also their mates who are doing some of these challenges and then encouraging our children to, you know, take part in them. And I think whilst clearly not all challenges are harmful and dangerous, because of course they're not, there are some that are, and I think we're very familiar, sadly, with some of the very extreme stories, like the story about Archie Battersby, who was involved in that choking challenge. You know, that there are always going to be those children who are more vulnerable, perhaps for a whole host of different reasons. The research on challenges and, you know, hoaxes and things like that is that most children are aware that they exist, but actually, thankfully, not that many of them will engage with some of these challenges, but of course some do, and I think we just have to recognise that. You'll be very familiar as professionals with some of the sort of research around the brain development and, you know, the prefrontal cortex of the teenage brain. It just hasn't developed to a point where they can think about, deal with, manage or understand risk or think about consequence. And from what I've read, you know, girls are going to be in their late teens, boys mid-20s before that part of the brain is fully functioning. You know, so things that I might look at and say, yeah, I'm not going to do that because if I do, these things could happen as a result. I think for an awful lot of young people, they will just do it, and it will only be when they're lying in hospital with a broken leg that they'll realise it wasn't such a good idea. My point being that they won't necessarily think about it at the time. I think it's really helpful that we've got some guidance from the DFE on this. This guidance came out in February of last year, and you know, I think whatever a school does with regards to a hoax or a challenge, you know, whether you decide to tell parents or whether you don't decide to tell parents, you're never going to get it right, are you? But I think at least if you can say, look, we followed the guidance from the DFE, and the bottom line with this guidance, by the way, is that, you know, we shouldn't mention, you know, specific challenges or hoaxes by name because that gives them airtime. I think we should perhaps just use it as an opportunity to say, look, you know, if this sort of thing happened, if you encountered this type of content, this is what you should do. So if I go back to the research again, still with the 3 and 4 year olds, up until this year, the question that Ofcom asked the sort of respondents to the research was, do you use social media? And I think the problem with asking that question is a lot of children, certainly under 13, were saying, yeah, I use social media. And actually they weren't. They were watching their parents use it or a big brother or sister using it. So this time they actually asked the question, have you got your own social media profile? And in the small print, it made very clear that actually that meant that the user, the child, had some control and ownership over that profile. And you can see that it's 24% of the 3 and 4 year olds who have their own profile allegedly. It's worth saying that the profile on the social media platform, it's social media platforms that you're meant to be 13 to use, you know, so it's not something that is made specifically for a very young child. And on the right you can see the percentages of the different age groups. So, you know, by the time they're in Key Stage 2, 60% of them are using social media platforms, but by the time they're in secondary or senior school, you know, it's 89%. And, you know, this is before any of them are meant to be using any of these platforms. These are the particular platforms that they're using, and I think you'll recognise an awful lot of these. If you don't, that's the actual list of them. I think things like TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, you know, Twitter, Pinterest, and even Reddit on that top row, they've really stood the test of time. They've been around for a long time, and yes, they've evolved a bit, you know, and sort of kept pace with their competitors and, you know, added new features, but they have really been around for a while, and I think they will continue to be around for a while. Two that I've added that Ofcom didn't pick up are the two at the bottom right. So the first one is Discord and the second one is Twitch, and I think the reason Ofcom didn't, you know, pick up on those is because they're not actually social media sites in the truest sense of the word. They're both very much associated with gaming, or at least that's how they started life, you know, with young people who were gaming. Discord I think with this sort of third-party chat application, it's evolved into more than that now. But the way it would work is that if I was sort of involved in a game, I might have a Discord chat open with some of the other people on my team, so we could talk about strategy and so on without anybody else knowing. And Twitch, which is the last one on the bottom row, live streaming, so it's where they're actually watching other people live streaming themselves playing games and things like that. Nothing wrong necessarily with any of these apps. I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about during the presentation is just people who are behaving in the wrong way. So it's not always the tech that's at fault, it's often the behavior. This research here, this actually came out just last week, so this is really fresh, again from Ofcom, as you can see, and it just sort of breaks down the percentages of children of different ages who are using the different platforms. And I just think it's quite interesting to see that you've got 79% of the 8 to 12-year-olds who are using Snapchat, 67% on Instagram, 65% on TikTok. Interesting that Facebook still features. I think we hear in the press that actually young people don't use Facebook. I mean, they clearly do according to this research. I have to say, I'm slightly confused by the fact that 68% of the 8 to 12-year-olds are saying that they have their own profile on Twitter. That isn't what I'm seeing when I'm in schools, but that is what the research has found. If we move to the 5, 6 and 7-year-olds, 28% now have got their own mobile phone. That's doubled since last year, and I think clearly the pandemic is still playing a part. It's having an impact. A lot more people got online a lot earlier. The other one I've just highlighted there is that 39% are using live streaming apps and sites. Now, you can live stream on most of the things that we saw on the previous slide, all of the different social media platforms. And to be fair, this age group, they're not actually creating the live stream content, but they are consuming the live stream content. And the only point I would make, and I think we need to try and sort of raise awareness of this with parents, is that if parents are filtering the internet and being careful about what their children can access, if somebody behaves inappropriately in a live stream, that's not going to be picked up by their filtering. It's happening in real time, so potentially the damage is done. And I think yes, we could block live streaming completely, but then parents can't use it, older children can't access it, and there's very positive things that we can get from live streaming, but it's just important, I think, to make them aware. I just wanted to say with the youngest children, because clearly, I do a lot of work with 3 and 4-year-olds around how they stay safe online, and it's a conversation and we read a story. So what I'm trying to say is it doesn't need to be horrible and scary, but I think we do need to start to introduce the opportunity to have conversations about what it is that they're doing online when they're at home. The other thing that I just wanted to quickly flag, the UK Council for Internet Safety, so this is a government organisation. It is chaired by 3 ministers from DFE, DCMS and the Home Office, and basically anything that is produced by the government around online safety in schools or for other organisations, social workers or whatever, it comes from UKIS. And certainly when I actually did the live session, which was last week now, very few people were aware of UKIS, and that is not your fault. It's because it hasn't been advertised well enough, and I sit on various UKIS committees and we constantly discuss how we can make schools more aware of the sort of really good, I think, information that UKIS creates. So what you can see on the screen, this is some sort of online safety guidance for early years practitioners and early years managers, which I think is really helpful. What you can also see here are 3 sort of very recent publications. 6th of October, I think they came out. So there's been an update on the top left-hand side to some guidance that was written trying to help schools to make good decisions when they get external providers to actually come into their school and deliver online safety. The one in the middle I think is really important, and we updated that just a couple of months ago, but it's only just been published. This is questions for governors to ask their school about online safety. Now, I definitely think that given the sort of heightened focus on governors in Casey, it would be really good to give this to your governors. I mean, look at it first before you give it to them, because you want to be able to answer the questions that they will then ask. I think what is really helpful about it, it talks about what good practice would look like. It also talks about when they might need to be concerned. concerned. But I really think that's a crucial one. Top right, this is a new piece of guidance. It's not been updated. This is completely new. How we challenge victim blaming language and behaviours when we're talking about the online experiences that children have had online. Just to say, many of you in the past will have used some of the CEOP videos, the Think You Know videos, and I certainly have used them. You may be aware that many of them aren't available through the Think You Know website any longer, and that's just because, you know, thinking has evolved, and I think we realised that some of those videos, although very shocking and quite impactful, they used victim blaming language. Some of you might remember the video that was aimed at sort of Key Stage 2, where a girl came out of her house and sort of put this for sale sign in, and on the for sale sign was her social media profile, and partway through that video the girl says, that's when I realised what I'd done wrong. And of course, you know, she was a victim. She hadn't really done anything wrong, and I think we need to think carefully about the language that we use. So, you know, this is a really helpful document. The other one that you can see at the bottom, again, this has been out for maybe a year, 18 months now, but it's an online safety audit for ECTs or trainee teachers. And again, you know, just a helpful document to kind of put under their noses, I guess. If we go back to the research, Key Stage 2 now, year 3, 4, 5 and 6, 60% have their own mobile phone. And, you know, 2 years ago, I would have confidently said to you, you know, the age when children tend to get their first mobile phone is around 10, 11, when they move from year 6 to year 7, you know, from primary to secondary. COVID has changed that. You can see that there is still a jump, you know, from 62 to 91% between the age of 10 and 11. But you can also see that, you know, a third of the 6-year-olds have actually got their own phone, and the vast majority of those are smartphones. Now, you know, if a parent chooses to do that, that's up to them, I guess. The good news for me is that you can give somebody a phone and you can lock it down so that, you know, they can barely do anything with it. If that's what you choose to do, what I'm trying to say is that the tools are there, the tools are available. The Ofcom research finds, however, that about 50% of parents do not use any form of parental control on their broadband or on their child's device for a lot of different reasons. I mean, 25% said we didn't even know that you could do that, which I think is quite strange that, you know, that you wouldn't be aware of these tools. But anyway, the other 25% said, well, actually, I've tried to use them in the past. They're not really good. They slowed my machine down. I couldn't access things that I needed to access. Or they'll say my child seemed to find a way around it. Probably because, you know, the parent used the password that they use for everything else, or they'd written it down, or whatever. I wanted to say something really quickly about gaming. You can see here that 69% of the Key Stage 2 children are playing games online, and it goes up actually slightly to, I think, 76% of the 12 to 15-year-olds. Gaming gets a lot of bad press, and it's not always justified. You know, they can learn some amazing skills when they're gaming. They can, you know, make new friends. I think, you know, certainly a lot of children spoke about gaming post some of the lockdowns that we had, and said it helped them to feel less isolated. You know, it was the way that they kept in touch with their friends. But there are challenges. I think there are challenges in terms of who they're communicating with. There are challenges in terms of the content that they're engaging with, and also about, you know, the time they spend and potentially the money that they might spend as well. This website, I just wanted to quickly share. I think this is, you know, really helpful for parents, because it helps them to make better decisions. And it's one of those websites where, you know, you can search on a particular game title, and I've put in here Grand Theft Auto. I've never been in a year 5 and 6 class where somebody hasn't been playing GTA, even though it's an 18 rated game. And it's telling me straight away, you know, that it's PEGI 18, drugs, violence, killing, sex and torture. It then shows me a very balanced but fairly detailed overview of the game, and there's also always a link to a video that shows actual gameplay. And I think that's really helpful, because then I can look at that as a parent and think, well, how would my son or my daughter react to that? You know, is it too graphic? How would they deal with the content? How would it affect them? But then the best bit, I think, is this, you know, that they provide alternative suggestions. So, you know, games that are like GTA, but actually suitable for a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 12-year-old or whatever. And the feedback from young people has been that the alternative suggestions are really good. So, you know, you get to drive the fast cars, but there aren't any, you know, drugs or prostitutes, which is clearly a really good thing when you're only 10 years old. So I think it's just about giving parents some options. I'm not suggesting that you can go and say to a group of 14-year-olds, okay, I know you've been playing GTA for a while, but you need to stop playing it now and try one of these alternatives. That's probably not going to work, let's be honest. But I think making parents aware of some of these things when their children are younger, I think can be helpful. It's impossible really, I think, to do a session about online safety without just making a reference to the metaverse. There's lots of discussion going on at the moment about the metaverse. I've been to lots of different conferences and webinars recently. I think there's lots of different views about what it actually is. Some people say, oh, well, it's pretty much just virtual reality. Others say, no, it's way more than that. It's extended reality, augmented reality, a kind of mixture of lots of different things. But I think what is very clear is it's a very immersive experience. And we've talked about VR for quite a long time now, and quite a lot of young people have tried it or experienced it. But I think the cost was a real barrier to it being widely adopted. Meta are so confident that the metaverse is going to be the next big thing that they changed the name of the company. So Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, who now own Instagram and WhatsApp, they're the sort of overarching company is now called Meta. They're making a loss on their Quest headsets at the moment because they want mass adoption. We're hearing about the sort of Ray-Ban Stories glasses which are coming out. We're hearing that Apple are going to be producing some glasses in the near future as well. So I think the headlines that we see, and you can see one at the top right, that was based on the Dispatches program on Channel 4, and that's really grim. A barrage of assault and racism and rape jokes. And again, please don't get me wrong, there will be bad actors in all of these spaces, of course there will, but there are things that we can do. You can put a safety bubble around yourself, you can block somebody, you can report them, you can mute them. And I've no doubt, having listened to some of the experts at the conferences, that actually, if somebody, behaves inappropriately towards you in one of these spaces, it will feel very intense. It can often be very difficult to sort of distance yourself from that. But there are tools available, Meta's virtual reality parental supervision tools. What you know as well as I do is that a lot of parents won't even bother to use those. So, we just need to raise awareness of the fact that these things are there. Yes, for the parents, but also I think for children as well. What I wanted to just move on to now, I've just mentioned there that quite often the headlines, focus on the really extreme things. I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about the things that I believe, and I've got some evidence to back this up, children are most likely to run up against, when they're going through school, when they're online, obviously. And what you can see on the screen here, 37% of the 12 to 15 year olds, and it was 32% of the Key Stage 2 children, said that they'd seen something that they thought was worrying or nasty online. Now, that was self-reported, so there could have been things that I, as a parent or teacher, had a massive problem with, but they didn't see it as an issue. They didn't even think it was harmful or inappropriate, so they didn't include it in that percentage. And also what happened to the third of children almost who saw something worrying or nasty. Are they still bothered by it? Did they get some help? Is it still causing problems, and so on? But then you have to think, well, what does worrying or nasty mean? How do you define that? And the government at the moment are pushing the online safety bill through Parliament, and it's stalled because of everything that's been going on with leadership campaigns and things like that. But they talk a lot in there about what harmful but legal content is. So harmful but legal content. And again, what does that even mean? And I want to try and give you a little bit of an insight into what the researchers think that might mean. I think it's really important just to remind you here, social media, 47% of young people said it was social media where they encountered their most recent potential harm. And on the right, I've just put those percentages of children who are using social media. So there's lots of positives about social media, but I do believe a lot of them are going to be affected by what I'm just about to show you. So this is a really interesting detailed piece of research that came out last year, done by an organisation called Revealing Reality. They do a lot of work with Ofcom, but they were commissioned by Five Rights to do this. And what they did, they followed a number of young people over a long period of time. And rather than saying to them, oh, tell us what you do when you're on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, when, they're going to tell you what they think they should tell you they do when they're using those platforms, and they'll forget things, to be fair, they actually installed trackers onto their devices, and over a long period of time, they were able to see exactly what they were doing when they were using all of these different social media sites. What they then did, they created what they called avatar accounts that represented the young people. And the reason they did it like that is they knew that as part of the experiment that they were setting up, the accounts were going to be exposed to harmful content. So clearly you can't do that with real children. So we've got these avatar accounts. 3 parts to the experiment, if you like. The first one was they set up accounts on Instagram and TikTok and did absolutely nothing. So they waited to see what the platforms offered to the accounts. So, that was the For You page on TikTok. It was the Explore page on Instagram. Second part, they started to follow other accounts, celebrities, film stars, models, sports personalities, whatever, influencers. And then the third part, the final part, they started to interact with content. So they liked other people's stuff, they commented on other people's stuff, and they started searching for things as well. And they started searching for things that I think, as parents and teachers, we'd be fine with, but they started looking for things that weren't appropriate as well. But, that reflected what the real children had done. So it was right, it was representative. So 4 key findings. The first one was that in every single case, the avatar accounts were proactively contacted by strangers. And that was every case on Instagram, by the way. It was slightly different with TikTok, but Instagram, every single case. What you can see here is what was pushed, to an avatar that represented a 14-year-old boy. And on the right there, if you clicked on those hyperlinks, it did take you to third-party adult content, which is clearly not okay. So the second finding, I'm sure will not come as any surprise to any of you. The accounts were given more of the content that they showed an interest in because, that's how it works. The algorithm will kick in and try and show you stuff that it thinks you're going to spend time looking at. So this is what was pushed to an avatar representing a 15-year-old girl on the first day, and it's very varied. They don't know who she is, they haven't got a profile about her yet, so it's quite a mixture of different sorts of content. This one is day 2. This one is day 3. This is day 5, and in the research it actually went up to day 10. And I'm not going to click any further through because I think some of the content is quite distressing, and it's there in the research. You can access it through the PDF, and it is worth having a look, although it is quite sobering. And this particular profile had done searches for things like weight loss, body image, diet. They'd searched on the hashtag thinspiration, and within 5 days, you can see how very focused that feed has become. The third finding. The researcher said, even though the platforms knew the age of the account holder, if that makes sense, they were still able to access all of that content, eating disorders, suicide, self-harm and so on. And they said in some cases what they found shouldn't have been there at all. It broke all of the community guidelines. It shouldn't have been there for an adult, let alone a child, a young person. But it had slipped through the net. And the final finding, again, probably not a huge surprise, this is around adverts. So there was some age-appropriate adverts alongside some stuff that was really not appropriate. And I've got a couple of examples, I think, for you. So this one here, this is what was pushed to an account, avatar account representing a 14-year-old boy. So we've got Roblox, the gaming platform, which I don't really have a problem with. We've got a revision kind of study guide, which is brilliant. And then it's interspersed with the adult content. And it's not explicitly pornographic because it's Instagram and you can't have pornography on Instagram. But it doesn't leave a lot to the imagination, as I'm sure you can see. And again, there were hyperlinks that you could click on. And this last one, this is what was pushed to an avatar representing a 13-year-old girl. So, we've got stuff there for sweets, sanitary products, a games console, and then the 2 that are faded out, suicide and depression, essentially. On the right there, that account was called Sadly Broken, and it says it's so easy to end it all. And then on the left, they'd searched and got results for the hashtag depressed videos. This is, somebody who apparently is 13. who may start clicking on this, and the timeline could fill up with this. And I think, we're very, aware at the moment of this tragic story of Molly Russell, who was bombarded with this sort of content some years ago now, and we were told that things had improved, but this was only last year, and I think still clearly more needs to be done. The last part of this, or almost the last part of this, we've seen a lot of children from year 5 upwards actually in schools saying that they're being exposed to huge amounts of content on TikTok mainly that's related to the conflict in Ukraine. And I think they're finding it really hard to process and deal with. And I think a couple of quick points to make here. I think it's incredibly powerful that somebody who is living through that nightmare is able to video what is happening in their city or outside their front door, and share it with huge numbers of people to raise awareness of what is happening. I think there's 2 challenges, probably more, but 2 that I'll highlight. I think one is that the content, it's raw, unedited footage, and I think a lot of people struggle with what's on the news at 9 o'clock on the BBC or whatever. That's been sanitized, it's been edited, if you like. Very often this hasn't. And I think the other obvious point is that it's not all true. There's a lot of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and we need to help young people to be able to distinguish between what is real and what is fake, which is not always easy. Just a quick example, I've spoken to several children. There was a girl who sticks in my mind, and I think she was year 7 or year 8. And she'd been bombarded with some of this stuff, and she said to me, I started looking at some of these videos, and she said, I know I shouldn't have done. She said, but then my timeline was just full of them, and I don't know what to do. I haven't been able to tell anybody. Having nightmares, can't sleep, constantly on my mind. And I said, why haven't you told anybody else? And she said, because if I tell my parents, they're going to take my phone away and say I can't use TikTok any longer. So that's the problem, isn't it? They are seeing this stuff but don't feel able to go and speak to anybody about it, which I think is a huge problem. The other thing that I thought was worth just putting in here is something about Andrew Tate. I'm sure many of you are aware of Andrew Tate. He became incredibly popular over the summer, had huge influence over a lot of people who were using platforms like TikTok and YouTube and Twitter. The narrative that he was pushing was incredibly toxic, misogynistic, and he's fortunately been banned from all of the main social media platforms. He's now using a platform called Rumble, and sadly young people know that he's on that platform called Rumble. I've been to a lot of secondary schools in the last few weeks where schools have quite understandably said, can you talk about Andrew Tate? I think pupils fall into 2 different camps. I started discussing him by putting an image up of him, and then it's quite interesting to see their reaction. You either got sort of, what are you talking about him for, he's an idiot, or you got the, whoa, yeah, what a legend, absolutely brilliant. And then you get into the discussion about why they might think he's a legend. A lot of young people have sort of said, well, people are just jealous because he's made lots of money. Talked about the narrative and talked about the people who reshared his content, and it's very interesting. I think it's really important to talk about why what Andrew Tate is sort of peddling is not okay, and there are resources that will help us to do this, by the way. Just one quick one, in fact I think I've got 2 here. London Grid for Learning and DFE, a free resource aimed at Key Stage 3 in this case, looking at online extremism, and I think just trying to sort of provide schools with a framework of different things that they can do. So lots of really useful lesson plans and case studies that you can discuss, and I think the idea is just to get young people talking about the things that they might see, and then actually giving them some resources to push back against it when it isn't appropriate. This one actually came out last week. It was the same week of the conference. Again, London Grid for Learning, and they've done some work with the Counter-Terrorism Policing Unit, and this resource is aimed at sort of preventing radicalisation, and again it's real life stories that allow us to sort of start a conversation, and some quite detailed lesson plans that we can just take off the shelf and use if it's appropriate. The reason I've shared all of this just in the last probably 5 or 10 minutes is because I honestly believe if children are using social media platforms, even if they're not doing anything they shouldn't be, even if they're not searching for content that's harmful, they're going to see stuff that is harmful, and depending on who they are, they may really struggle to cope and manage with that. I think the other point I would just make, a lot of parents will say to me when I do a parent talk, yeah, That's exactly why I've not given my child a phone. That is exactly why my children are not allowed on social media until they're 13. That's all great, and I genuinely mean that that's all great. But I think parents shouldn't be naive in thinking that, you know, their children are not sitting next to people in class, on the playground with people who absolutely do have access to these platforms and very often have access to devices that are not even filtered or restricted at all. There's a little bit of good news. The government, I mentioned the online safety bill. That's not going to kick in for a couple of years really, and then it's too late for the children that we're teaching today. We've already got something called the Age Appropriate Design Code. It's often referred to as the Children's Code, and basically this was the government saying to the big tech companies, look, you've created these online spaces for children. Sorry, let me start that again. You've created these online spaces for adults essentially, but loads of children are using them, and because they're children, you know, they need extra protection, so you need to do something about that. And in fairness, the tech companies have done, they've stepped up. So everything that you can see on the screen here, this all exists already. Yeah. So the tech companies have put all of these things in place globally, even though the laws are just UK laws. So I'm just going to pick out one. Top left, it says Instagram has said it will not allow unknown adults to DM under 18s. That's brilliant. That in theory means that the first finding in that research that we just looked at, where unknown adults could message children, that shouldn't happen any longer, which is great. That is a huge step forward. The problem is, you know as well as I do, that it absolutely does still happen, and the reason for that is that, you know, the platforms don't know how old our children are. They have lied about their age. You know, somebody who is 9 years old who was using TikTok had to at least inflate their age by 4 years. That it would be one thing if they'd, you know, just said that they were 13, but most children in primary schools that I talk to have done one of two things. They either scroll the wheel so it just goes way beyond 13, so you know that they're safe, or they use their parents' date of birth because they can remember that. So the point is, you know, they aren't going to be given all of these protections because the platform doesn't know how old they are. So that's a problem. I think parents are a huge problem here. Again, this came out last week from Ofcom. This is looking at who helped you to actually, you know, set up your profile, and where I've put the arrows there, that sort of gold bar, that's where they had some help from their parents or guardians. So 30% helping, you know, 8 to 12-year-olds to set up TikTok, 43% helping them to set up Instagram. You know, and that may not have been lying about their age. It might have been how to have a private account or whatever. But the point is, if they're helping them to set these things up when they're between 8 and 12, they're too young to be using it. So, you know, parents are the weak link. So in this sort of last section, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the statutory requirements, some of the things that, you know, Casey or ISI or Ofsted might be saying. What you can see on the screen there is from Casey, really clear that, you know, children and young people need to know how and where they can report concerns. They need to know their concerns will be treated seriously and that they can safely express their views and give feedback. And, you know, I'm sure we'd all like to think that that is what is going to happen in our school. Do all members of staff, you know, absolutely know that that's what should happen? Certainly earlier on this term, working in a school where there'd been some instances with sexting or sharing nudes, and one member of staff had actually said to a girl who had shared an image, well, what were you thinking? You know, are you stupid? You know, why did you think that that was a good idea? You should have known that something like this would happen. Yeah, I mean, that's not, you know, giving somebody an environment where they can safely express, you know, their concerns and their views. So I think, you know, we need to think carefully about the language that we use. The research is not great around all of this. So this was some research done with a group of 13 to 17-year-olds in Denmark and Hungary in the UK. And the question that they were asked was, you know, something's gone wrong online. Why wouldn't you go and tell somebody? And, you know, just the one at the bottom, you know, 49% of those young people in the UK said because my parents would stop me from using the internet. It's very different in other countries. And I think, you know, we really do see that children over here in the UK, they put all these barriers up, all these reasons why they wouldn't go and speak to somebody, but very often it is because they fear the reaction from their parents. I think as children get older, you know, that go and speak to a trusted adult, it's not the first port of call for them, and we have to recognise that. And I think schools are very good at providing alternative means of reporting. But there's a couple of helplines I just wanted to really quickly mention. This one here, reportharmfulcontent.com, it's run by the UK Safer Internet Centre, and the idea of this is that if you've reported something to, I don't know, TikTok or Roblox or whatever, and you've got that annoying, you know, message back saying, yeah, thanks for reporting this, it doesn't actually violate any of our terms and conditions, so we're not going to do anything about it, well, then you can pass on the report to the helpline. They will look at it, and if they think actually you've got a point, this shouldn't be on Instagram, then they will actually, you know, remove that content. They will speak to somebody on your behalf and try and get that content removed. These are the different platforms that they're working with, and it's an ever increasing list, which is great. They've said that the reason they are successful is because they speak to a real person. You know, I file a report, or you do, and it goes off and it's read by an algorithm. It's a piece of, you know, technology, and they can't get the context and the nuance. When they published their annual report earlier this year, they had a 92% success rate in getting rid of stuff from Instagram that other people had tried to get rid of and weren't able to do it. So I think that's quite powerful. The other helpline, just really quickly, I'm sure some of you will know about this, but Report Remove, it is just aimed at children under 18, and it's for when that nude or nearly nude image has actually ended up online. Nightmare for children when that happens. They will help you to take it down, and they will also hash the image. So they do something to the image, they give it a kind of digital fingerprint, so that if somebody else tried to upload the image, even if they changed it a bit, you know, or photoshopped it, they wouldn't be able to do that. And I think that's very reassuring, you know, to young people to know that there is something that they can do. If we go back to Casey, paragraph 137 talks about all schools needing to have a clear policy on the use of mobile and smart technology in the school. Those of you who know Casey really well, you're all DSL, so I know that you will do. They added the word smart in last September, so, you know, in 2021, trying to take into account, you know, smart watches and wearable tech and things like that. These questions are my questions about that policy. You know, is it clear to everybody? If I came into your school and just chose random members of staff and pupils, would they all give me the same view of that policy? And I think really importantly, is it followed consistently? Does it reflect what is actually happening in school? And, you know, I remember being in a secondary school, the policy clearly said no mobile phones allowed in the dining room. And when the deputy head took me in there, half the school were on mobile phones, members of staff as well, kids huddled around them looking at things on them. And I said, you know, that's not what your policy says. And he sighed, so I knew it was going to be a good one. And he said, yeah, he said, you know, if you're the member of staff who goes and says, let's have that device, you know, it's confiscated, you make yourself really unpopular. And he said, you know, a lot of staff are really good at it at the start of term, but there are absolutely some staff who will never challenge it, they'll look the other way. But he said at this point in the term, and to be fair, it was near the end of term, he said, you know, people just want to kind of get to the end and we don't want to sort of make problems for ourselves. Well, but the problem is you're not following what your policy says, you know, so you need to change the policy. And I think these things need to be reviewed very, very frequently. And I think young people need to be involved in the creation of those policies as well. If you just quickly look at ISI, these are the regulatory requirements that came out last month, and it just says, you know, during an inspection, the effective implementation of the strategy in relation to cyberbullying, yes, but mobile phones will be checked through direct observation around the school, you know, and I think that's really good. I think as an ex-head teacher, I know that I wrote a lot of policies that probably nobody read, and we did them because we had to do them. But I think with this one, I think it's really important that it reflects what is actually happening. You know, these are the things that people can lose their jobs over, as you well know. So I think we need to, you know, kind of focus on them and make sure that everybody is aware. Just another bit really quickly from DFE. This is some guidance for heads and school staff, and a couple of things. I mean, it talks about not accepting friend requests from pupils past or present. You know, they added in the word past, I think because an awful lot of young people said, look, you know, a lot of adults would say, look, I'm not going to, you know, communicate or link up to, current students, that would be a breaching of the sort of, the code. But actually when they've left, that's okay, isn't it? Because I'm not their teacher any longer. And the trouble is, that they're still in communication with people who are still at the school. And I think what it does is it blurs the boundary between your personal life and your professional life. Some schools have said, you can't, friend pupils on social media until they've been gone for 3 years. I think if you do decide to do it, you need to have an account which is not your personal social media account. It needs to be one that is associated with the school. And the other one on here, don't give out personal contact details. On a school trip, you should have a school mobile phone rather than having to rely on your own. And I think, it's always a difficult one. I think a lot of schools are doing that now, but it doesn't happen everywhere. It is just guidance. It's not statutory guidance. But, if something went wrong and you hadn't followed the guidance, everyone's going to be pouring all over your policies and asking why you didn't follow it. As DSLs, you'll be really familiar with the sort of description at the front of CASE, which talks about the use of the word must and the word should. If it says you must do it, then you must do it. If it says you should do it, you really have to have a damn good reason why you're not doing it. So again, I think we just have to be aware about how this can go wrong. So the next bit I want to talk about really quickly is the guidance that came out in July, just as schools were, breaking up for the end of the summer term, on behaviour in schools. And you probably remember Gavin Williamson when he was the Education Secretary, and he talked about, the idea of a ban on mobile phones for all pupils in all schools. Very surprising that the government actually did a U-turn on that, and they actually said, we think that it should be left up to head teachers, and that's what the guidance focuses on. So I just want to sort of look at that in a little bit more detail. They talk very specifically, there's a whole section about mobile phones, and I think it's really good that they say that the decision about whether mobiles can be used during the day should actually sit with head teachers, and it says, pupils are going to have one of their own. But then it says, and it's so loaded, if you do allow access to mobiles in schools, you're going to be faced with complexity and risks. These things can be distraction, they can cause disruption, they can be used to bully and abuse other people, detriment to learning, and so probably you should actually consider restricting or prohibiting them in order to reduce those risks. However, it is up to you. I think what it doesn't talk about is the fact that, pupils who do have access to mobiles in a managed way, I'm not saying they have them out all the time, but it can, provide, a really useful tool for learning. And I think it's interesting that I think some of the research that the DFE used to sort of make those decisions around, Gavin Williamson saying that they should be banned, it was based on some very flimsy and not particularly robust research. What they then go on to say is that if you do, decide to take the risk and not impose restrictions on mobile phones, then there needs to be a clear plan to sort of mitigate those risks of allowing access. And I think that links very clearly back to what we talked about on the previous sort of few slides ago, that paragraph 137, that clear policy on the use of mobile and smart technology within the school. The other thing that the Behaviour in Schools document talks about in quite a lot of detail is about the responsibility of the school to deal with things that happen online, even when children aren't on the premises, if that makes sense. And I think, schools have always had to do that. If something happens, to do with cyberbullying or sharing of images, it'll happen outside of school in most cases, but it will absolutely impact on, your class at 9 o'clock the next morning when everybody's been talking about something, the night before. So it really is something that they talk about in quite a lot of detail, actually, that fact that we should be dealing with those things that don't happen on the premises but that may take place online. And I think it makes clear that the same standards of behaviour should be expected whether online or offline, and I think that's really important. I think for too long, as a society, we've sort of slightly had different ways of dealing with things that happen online. I think within a school situation, the behaviour policy, the rewards and sanctions or whatever you've got, I think that applies to the online stuff as well as the offline stuff. I wanted to say a few things just briefly about filtering and monitoring. I mean, it's quite a big sort of area, and I haven't got time to go into it in huge amounts of detail here. But you have a legal obligation to filter and monitor. This is keeping children safe in education. It talks in that document about having appropriate filtering and monitoring systems in place. And of course, the new bit is that governors need to regularly review the effectiveness of those things. I mean, they're not going to be able to do that on their own. Somebody in school is going to have to inform them. They're going to need need to be asking the right questions. In terms of what good filtering or appropriate monitoring actually looks like, again, CASE, they reference a document that is published every year by the UK Safer Internet Centre, which just sort of describes what good filtering and monitoring looks like. This is the latest version. Some schools were saying to me that they were waiting for the sort of 2022 version to come out. There isn't going to be a 2022 version. The folks at the UK Safer Internet Centre are happy that what was published in June, it hasn't fundamentally changed, although I think we can expect changes in 2023. I'm not going to go through the document in detail, but I think it's really important that schools are aware that it's there and then look at their own filtering and monitoring against these documents. This is the filtering one. I mean, I'll just pick out, one bit really. It talks about the fact that filtering should be age appropriate, absolutely, but also differentiated. So, if you've got the same level of filtering for reception as for year 6 or for year 7 as year 13, that is not differentiated filtering. And I think here, I've written not just the tech team. I think the tech team, the people who manage the network in school, are wonderful people, but I think it shouldn't just be them who are making decisions about this sort of thing. I think there needs to be a sort of whole school approach to it. And somebody said to me recently, well, I spoke to the network manager and they said they can't differentiate the filtering. Well, actually they can. I mean, it might cost more money, it might make their job a bit more difficult, but it absolutely can be done, and that is what the government are telling us we should be doing. And so I think it's just important, when you pay for all of this filtering, I think you need to road test it. I mean, tell somebody that you're going to do that, but then put yourself into the mind of a 13-year-old and type a few things in just to see what comes back. I wanted to briefly say something about monitoring as well. Again, you have to do this, you probably pay quite a lot of money for it, but I'd run a lot of training for sort of schools, and we did a session recently, and there was a head teacher of a primary school who happens to be the DSL, and he said, look, I get the monitoring reports once a week. He said they're really long, they're very detailed, dozens of pages actually, and he said it takes me quite a while to go through them, and lots of it's sort of false positive reports. And the problem with that is, if you get your monitoring report on a Monday and the following day somebody searches for, I don't know, self-harm, suicide, beheading, drugs, whatever, if you're not then going to find out until the following Monday, that's not okay, because that could lead to disaster, and there could be all sorts of things that happen, and I think it's quite sobering for some colleagues to realise that actually they're monitoring the internet, but in some cases they don't even get sent the report. They have to log in and look, and of course they forget to do that. I was talking to a colleague in a school recently, and actually it was the deputy head's PA who does it. Well, really fantastic person, but have they been trained? Do they know what they're looking for in those reports? There are some schools who get things sent to them in real time, depending on what the sort of severity of whatever it is that the monitoring has caught, and that's great. But who's set the thresholds? Are you happy with what is being sent through, and are you happy with what is being left for the kind of more general report? And I think so long as you've investigated this and you're happy with what you're doing, then that's great. But I've said who gets the reports? Are they at pupil level? So it's great if my monitoring report tells me that somebody in year 6 was Googling, I don't know, something inappropriate, drugs or whatever. It would be much better if my monitoring report tells me that Carl Hopwood in year 6 was looking for that sort of stuff. And again, Ofsted a while ago now said that actually, key stage 1, okay, you can get away with the whole class having a class login or a class password, but from key stage 2 upwards, no, that shouldn't be the case. There should be individual logins. And I know that people are going to say, oh, you come into my year 4 class on a Friday and they've all forgotten their password and we don't get anything done. That will only happen once, because actually they do remember passwords for Minecraft and Roblox and whatever else that they're using, and they can do it. It's just getting them into the habit of it. And if you're the person that gets the monitoring reports, is there a backup system? If you're not there for some reason, is somebody else getting them? Is it still being monitored? It's quite important, I think, that they've added into CASE, this year, that parents are likely to find it helpful to know what sort of systems you're using to filter and monitor the internet use. And also, it will be important for parents to be aware of what their children are being asked to do online. So it's just making sure that those channels of communication with parents are really, really transparent. It's interesting that in Casey, they actually refer to this document, Education for a Connected World. I said at the very beginning that, you know, Casey is the document where they tell us that we should be teaching and delivering online safety. And what Education for a Connected World has done is it's mapped out the skills and competences that children and young people should have across 8 different areas of online safety from the age of 4 to the age of 18. This is the bit in Casey, and it talks about, you know, the fact that the RSHE curriculum should be using, you know, sort of resources to address online sexual harassment, online abuse, and so on. And so I think it's just really important that this is now expected. And I think the fact that they're referencing Education for a Connected World means we should be aware of it. These are the 8 areas, and I think as soon as you look at those, you'll see that this does not any longer sit in the lap of the IT department. I totally understand why online safety started life there many years ago, and I know it's broadened out to sort of PSHE, but you know, if you look at self-image and identity, health, well-being and lifestyle, you know, that's got nothing to do with technology. I mean, technology absolutely plays a part in it, you know, in 2022, but I think this is a whole school issue and everybody needs to be aware. So, you know, one of the things that I've done that I'm really happy to share is I've taken all of the objectives across all 8 areas for each year group and I've put them onto one side of A4. And I think that's sometimes useful because then you can give it to whoever's responsible for year 8 or year 3 or whatever, and they can quickly look and see which ones they're absolutely nailing and perhaps which ones they need to have a little bit more support with. And in terms of the additional support, this is something called Project Evolve. This is a free service, a free tool. It's been created by the South West Grid for Learning, who are part of the UK Safer Internet Centre, and they've basically taken the 300 and odd objectives that I've just been talking about across those 8 areas, and they've put a resource behind it. You need to set up an account, but it's free, and then you can do all sorts of things to kind of work out which resources are going to be best placed for your pupils. There's an assessment tool that goes with it, knowledge mapping and things like that as well. So just a few sort of random bits just before we finish now. I think this document's really important. I often refer to this as keeping children safe in the sort of curriculum parts of the school day. So it's, as you can see, the after school clubs, the tuition, the kind of community activities. And it's a really big document, but there is a section about online safety. And it basically talks about the fact that, people who are running these breakfast clubs or after school clubs, they need to have an acceptable use policy. They need to be adhering to the filtering and monitoring that schools are already putting in place, and they need to know about that as well. Linked to that, the DFE have produced this guidance for parents, and it's suggesting some questions that parents might want to ask when they are deciding which out-of-school setting to choose for their child. And I've just picked out one example. There's a couple that are relating to the internet, and it says, well, is my child allowed unsupervised access to the internet? And the first statement is, your child should be 13 or older before they access the internet unsupervised. That is absolutely not what is happening in lots of after-school clubs and even breakfast clubs that I've sort of been working alongside when I've been in schools. So I think it's a classic example perhaps of where there's not a lot of joined up thinking going on at government level. Clearly the person who has written this guidance is not the person who is involved in Casey and things like that. So almost the last bit, it's quite unpleasant this, but I think it's really important to talk about. So every year, the Internet Watch Foundation, who are the hotline in the UK, so they have the job of removing the illegal content from the internet, so the child sexual abuse content, and they publish a report every year. And this came out in April, just gone. And there's been a really significant increase on the previous year. There's been an increase in the number of reports that they've been sent by members of the public who think they've found illegal content, but there's been a 64% increase on the previous year in reports that actually contain CSAM, so child sexual abuse material. And I think the really, bit that we need to concentrate on, girls were in 97% of the content. In 7 in 10 cases, it was 11 to 13-year-old girls, and again in 7 in 10 of the cases, the images were self-generated. Now, there's been a lot of criticism in the press about that term self-generated, because people said it means that the young people were complicit. That's absolutely not what they're trying to say. They just can't find a better term to use at the moment. But it basically means, as I'm sure you're well aware, that the the young people involved in these images were there on their own. Yeah, you know, they may well have been somebody at the other end of a webcam directing them to do something, but actually they were in their bedroom or in, you know, somewhere in the house on their own. And I remember a police officer who was presenting this report when it was launched, and he said one of the really chilling things for him was having to look at some of this content and in a video hearing somebody's mum or dad sort of shouting up the stairs, dinner's ready, you know, come downstairs, it's on the table now, and feeling, you know, parents think that their children are safe when they're at home. We want them to feel like that, but actually the internet has perhaps taken that away for some children. I wouldn't be this blunt when I'm talking to parents, and I think we shouldn't be, because I think then parents will ban their children, everything will be driven underground and they'll never know if something is going wrong. But I think it's really important that we are aware of, you know, some of the stats, and for me, you know, if we wait until they're in year 7 or year 8 or year 9 to talk about this stuff because it's a bit awkward, then we've missed a trick when 7 in 10 or 11 to 13-year-old girls. There are links, obviously, to the Ofsted report that was published last year into sexual abuse in schools and colleges. The headlines did not make for pleasant reading. You know as well as I do that in Casey and in the sort of report from Ofsted, it said that, you know, even if you're not aware of any reports of this happening in your school, you have to assume that it is happening. These are some of the stats from the Ofsted report, and, you know, just 3 things to sort of say here. The first one is staring you in the face. So boys are light blue, girls are dark blue in lots of different aspects of online safety. So cyberbullying, and definitely this one here, online sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Girls are more likely to be victims. That is just what the research shows. But what it absolutely shows on the graph is that boys can be victims as well. And unfortunately, in quite a lot of the media coverage, they gave the impression that girls were always victims, boys were always perpetrators. That was it, end of story. Second point, the left-hand side bit of the graph, we've got nearly 50% of boys, nearly 90% of girls saying that they were being sent sexual pictures and videos that they didn't want to see. That is an astonishingly high percentage, and I regularly talk to young people from year 6 upwards, to be honest, who've said that that's happened to them. I remember a girl in year 7, 3 weeks after it happened, she plucked up the courage to tell her parents. They were horrified, and, you know, with my parents hat on, I get that, but they basically banned her from Instagram. It happened on Instagram and they banned her from Instagram. And when I spoke to her, it was probably 3 weeks after she'd been banned from Instagram, and she was still angry. I mean, venomously angry, you know, and she said to me, I will never tell them about anything else that happens online. It's so unfair. I didn't do anything wrong. I was being responsible and telling them that this had happened, and I've been punished for it. You know, I hope that I changed her mind and said, you know, your parents are trying to look out for you. It's what parents have to do. You know, just talk to them, keep telling them about things that have happened. But she feels that it was really unfair. And, you know, I think it wasn't the right response in my view. I think they should have blocked the person, reported the person, probably told the school, because actually in this case it was happening to other people as well. Maybe the police need to be aware, you know, but I think, you know, doing nothing is not what I'm suggesting. But I think taking away her device when they'd been happy to let her have Instagram when she wasn't old enough and she had her own device, it wasn't the right response. And the last point I wanted to make is the next block in, 40% of boys, 80% of girls being put under pressure, you know, to provide sexual images of themselves. And of course, a lot of them won't succumb to that pressure, but some of them will. And the point is they shouldn't be being asked to, you know, share images in the first place. And again, sorry, that was just the bit that I sort of mentioned earlier on. So, you know, inspectors will expect you to assume that this is happening online, whether you've had reports of it or not. Just wanted to bring you right up to date with the research. You'll be very aware of the guidance around sharing nudes and semi-nudes, which has been updated in the last sort of year or so. But there was a bit of research came out again in July, just before you were heading off on the summer break, called Not Just Flirting. And it just updates the stats a bit. So these percentages are slightly different. 60% of girls, 31% of boys, you know, always that difference between them, have been asked to share a nude at some point in time. But the bit that I wanted to highlight, 34% of girls, 9% of boys were first asked to share that type of content when they were 13 or younger. Hence what I'm saying about us needing to talk about it from a very early age in an age-appropriate way. And this is the resource that I would really recommend you use. This is part of the D-Shame project. Initially, it was aimed at 13 to 17-year-olds. There are now resources for 9 to 12-year-olds. They're really good. You know, that they've really developed these lessons in collaboration with experts on this stuff. And it's not an easy thing to be talking about. You know, the 9 to 12 stuff, they have little scenarios that you can talk about, and it's a conversation starter. They won't all work for your school, but you can reshape them, and it just sort of starts the dialogue off, I think. So the last bit, you probably saw in Casey again, that it talks about schools carrying out an online search as part of their due diligence on shortlisted candidates. And in the draft version of Casey, it actually said carrying out an online search brackets including social media close brackets. And this is what we've ended up with. I think a lot of schools were already doing that because they knew that as soon as they said, you know, we're delighted that Mr. Hopwood is going to be teaching year 4 next year, parents are going to be Googling Mr. Hopwood, and so are children, just to kind of find out more about him. I think it's one thing for schools to have been doing that, but it's another for the government to be suggesting that they ought to do it. And I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of inadvertently discriminate against candidates. We need to think about, you know, what information we're going to share with an interview panel, a shortlisting panel. We need to think about who actually does the online search. I think it links very closely to, you know, online reputation, which we talk a lot to children about. I do a lot of work with the teaching unions, and they tell me that so much of their casework is, you know, framed around, you know, teachers who have got things wrong online. And I think I've already mentioned that boundary between your personal life and your professional life. This is just a good example. This was a primary school, and they tweeted, you know, I don't normally comment on Twitter, but, you know, watching Piers Morgan on Question Time, and then you can read the rest. And Piers Morgan, you know, replied, you represent a primary school speaking like this on Twitter, wow. And actually, you know, Gowerton Primary School, not that many followers. Piers Morgan, lots of followers, and so suddenly everybody knows. And, you know, I think what had happened here is that the person who, you know, runs the primary school Twitter feed hadn't logged out of that and logged into their own and was, you know, making that comment. So we just have to be careful. It can go wrong so easily. So just to summarise, the things that I think are important, I think pupils need to be involved in these discussions around, you know, the curriculum for online safety, but also the policy around it as well. I think it's important that we regularly review provision, just because this stuff changes so quickly. You know, the next thing is going to be these smart glasses, and not everybody will have them, but you can get prescription versions of them. You know, so we're going to find it quite hard potentially to say actually you can't wear those glasses. But, you know, when somebody's standing talking to you and actually they're recording everything and taking photographs, that changes the dynamic. So we just need to be ready for this. I think it's really important that we evaluate the impact of what we're doing. I think we're very good in schools at, you know, looking at, I don't know, a phonics intervention, a maths intervention, and demonstrating the impact that it has had. I think we're not very good at doing that in terms of online safety. I think the problem is children are very good at saying this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do, but it doesn't necessarily translate into their behaviour. I think all stakeholders need to be involved, especially parents, especially governors, I've already mentioned. And I think all staff need to take some responsibility. It's not okay to think, oh, that's Carl's job because he's the IT coordinator or whatever. Vulnerable groups, haven't even had a chance to talk about them, and I'm looking at the time and I've already gone 5 minutes longer than I did when we did the face-to-face session, so apologies for that. There's a lot of really good resources coming out now. There has been a gap, but I think we've got some really good resources for children with SEND, neurodiverse children and so on. I've added them to the PDF so you'll have access to some of them. A really good one from ChildNet called Thrive, aimed at Key Stage 3. And lastly, I think we mustn't shy away from the stuff that's very difficult. I think schools are very good at talking about cyberbullying, maybe not quite so good and not quite so confident at talking about, you know, the impact of online pornography on, you know, teenage relationships. Not so good perhaps at talking about the sort of sharing of nude images and the coercion that might go alongside that. But I think we have to tackle it, and we have got some good resources to do that. So that's it. We've made it to the end. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If anybody has, my email address is there. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want more information, if you want me to talk about something that I didn't really get into. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time, indeed, if any time, talking about obsessive use, addictive behaviours, online gambling. It's so wide a topic, and it's impossible to fit everything into even an hour and 7 minutes. But thank you for listening. I will stop now, and please do get in touch if there's anything else I can help with. Thanks very much.